before we get started, I'm going to do a quick introduction. I will be moderating today's panel. I'm very excited about this. I've had the honor of working with CHIRP in the past. I've just gotten in touch with Anakbayan, and I'm so glad to make this connection. So, as you know, this is Philippines in Environmental Justice and the Struggle for National Liberation. This workshop is an introduction to the intersection between climate justice, anti-war, and national democratic activism in the Philippines. A longtime neo-colony of the United States, the Philippines today stands at the center of many battles. It is a launching pad for US wars and occupation, an extraction and dumping base for multinational corporations, a site of prolonged people's resistance actively contesting the power of the state, and finally, a country on the front lines of ecological devastation driven by climate change. Speakers will connect these problems by holistically examining the roots of climate catastrophe and militarism in the Philippines, starting with an overview of the Philippines and followed by a discussion of indigenous environmental defense, election violence, and people's resistance. The presentation hopes to inform and encourage the peace and climate movements in the US to think deeper about the needs and struggles of global South countries like the Philippines. Our speakers today include members of Anakbayan Chicago and the Chicago Committee for Human Rights in the Philippines, also known as CHIRP. Anakbayan Chicago is the Chicago chapter of Anakbayan, a comprehensive national democratic mass organization of Filipino youth and students. CHIRP is a solidarity organization united to advocate for human rights in the Philippines, including a struggle for the protection and advancement of human rights in the Philippines and the welfare of Filipinos and abroad. Our four presenters today are Evelyn, and again, if I mispronounce your name, please let me know, Evelyn Zepeda, Danny Monaghan, Will Armette, and Love Jordan. All right, and the floor is yours.
All right, thank you so much for that introduction, Liz. So first, I am going to be, we'll just explain the agenda. We've got, so on the next slide, we've got the agenda here. Like we said, we're going to be going over about 5 different sections, and we will try to get through these slides in order to have a little bit of time for discussion afterwards. So first, my name is Will. I'm going to be taking up the background slide. I'm a member of CHIRP, and yeah, I think we can get into it. So next slide. All right, so it's important to understand kind of the imperial background of US intervention in the Philippines and how it relates to the climate disaster that we are currently seeing in the country. So next slide. So US intervention in the Philippines began in 1898 with the seizure of the country from the Spanish Empire during the Spanish-American War. The Philippines was originally colonized starting in 1521 by the Spanish. Filipino rebels had been waging a war of liberation against the country when the US intervened, or against the Spanish. And the US basically made a very short-term alliance with those rebels and then stabbed them in the back and then proceeded to wage a counterinsurgency war in the country for the next decade or so. But it's important to understand what the US actually wants in the Philippines. So next slide. There are 4 main reasons why the US took over the Philippines. Firstly, natural resources, cheap labor, as a dumping ground for surplus products, and as a strategic base in Asia. Now, on the next slide, you will see that this is important because the Philippines is situated in the Western Pacific Rim, just southwest of the Asian landmass, making it prime real estate for US empire. It sits along important trade routes while also serving as a potential staging ground for war in the Pacific, a threat that is today aimed at confronting a resurgent China. But besides these strategic reasons, there's also, the question of the Philippines' massive resources. So on the next slide, basically natural resources such as gold, iron, and copper are mined from the earth by multinational corporations and extractivist industries, whereas on the next slide, you will see that lumber and oil are also major resources of the Philippines. So multinational corporations exploit these resources for vast profits, often at the expense of local residents and workers. This creates a number of environmental challenges for the Philippines, especially tied to the military. So next slide. So environmental disaster in the Philippines is innately tied to the US military presence in the country. A lack of responsibility for the US to clean up toxic waste from military bases that contaminate sites and surrounding environments is a persistent issue. Two of the most infamous military bases, Clark and Subic, were the largest US bases in the Pacific. They were closed in the early 90s as a result of people's protests, but the US left enormous amounts of toxic waste in the area, which continues to contaminate the water, affecting the local population. Another example of this environmental disaster is when the U.S. Navy ship ran aground on the Tubata Reef, one of the Philippines' oldest ecosystems where many internationally endangered marine species live. But we can move into the next slide. So also important in terms of understanding environmental disaster is the issue of climate migrants. So large-scale displacement triggered by climate and weather-related hazards intensified in many parts of the world in 2018 and 2019. In the last few years, massive typhoons have devastated parts of the Philippines as well. Transnational corporations with mining, logging, etc., has exponentially increased the damages of these disasters. And on top of this, government and corporate corruption creates a major obstacle to any form of disaster relief, which in turn drives migrations as a means of survival. So the Filipino diaspora is not solely caused by climate change, but there are 12 to 15 million Filipinos abroad, and a number of these in recent years have been driven by environmental disaster. So I'm going to hand it over to Evelyn for the next section on indigenous struggle and attacks on environmental defenders.
Yeah, thanks, Will. So as Will mentioned, there are many disastrous effects from US corporate caused climate change in the Philippines, but there are indigenous people fighting to defend the environment, as we'll see in this next section. So next slide, please. So the Philippines is a very diverse nation in indigenous tribes. There are 14 to 17 million indigenous peoples in the Philippines, 61% of which are the Lumad, a term referring to indigenous people in southern Philippines who are not Muslim. Many are continuously fighting to defend their ancestral domains and fighting to get groups like multinational corporations off their land, much like the fight against the Line 3 pipeline that was built on indigenous lands here in the US and in Minnesota by the Enbridge Corporation. Next slide, please. So one such fight is for the Pantaron mountain range in Mindanao, one of the 3 island groups and the largest island in the south of the Philippines. So if we look on the map on the left-hand side, that is the island circled there in red. So this is one of the last biodiversity corridors with old growth forests and the ancestral home of Luma communities who have lived in respect and harmony with the land for centuries. But as Will mentioned, timber plantation operations and mining projects are encroaching upon the forests and the mountain range of Pantaron, and Luma tribes are being forced out of the places they call their home. Does anyone have any questions about this section or these last 2 slides before I move on? Okay. So yeah, so we can move forward. Next slide, please. So this is happening all over the Philippines, where the government and global corporations are putting profit over people and the planet, violating indigenous rights and treaties, and exploiting the land for natural resources in order to meet the capitalistic greed of the first world countries. This is something that we must acknowledge in the environmental movement. You know, we talk a lot about renewable energy, but much of the raw materials needed to make electric cars, lithium batteries, solar panels, and such come from exploitative mining practices in the global south that create ecological degradation and pollution and also harm indigenous communities and the people of the global south. This is something that we must acknowledge about the green transition and think about what it is that we're actually fighting for and who will actually affect around the world. So next slide, please. So in the Philippines, we also see the government and global corporations that seek natural resources being backed by US military aid, which is funding the bloodshed in the billions across the Philippines. More than 3 billion of our US tax dollars is being used for militarization in the Philippines and sending military weapons used for close range combat, meaning that it's not for the defense of the Philippines, but intended to target the Filipino people themselves, which is what we see the military doing, is being hired to attack and force the Lumad people off their lands through violent actions. So next slide, please. So this is just a question to reflect on for you all, our audience. So what are some ways our tax dollars could be used here in the US to benefit the people instead of funding violence abroad in the Philippines? So I'll give you all a few seconds to kind of think about that question a little bit as we move forward with the presentation. So as we mentioned, our tax dollars are being used to attack indigenous people in the Philippines. There are also attacks and raids targeting Lumad schools, which are schools built to reflect the needs of the Lumad people and their right to education, their educational systems that teach their distinct languages, cultures, and histories. The Lumad schools have increased literacy rates immensely, with some youth able to speak 4 languages and are essential to raising the next generation. But under the current Duterte administration, 300 of these schools have been closed down, with soldiers destroying, burning, and vandalizing Lumad schools and arresting students, teachers, and Lumad elders. Our tax dollars are funding this violence. So yes, we need to tax the rich, and changes in the system need to be made so that tax money actually goes back to the people instead of funding violence and use imperialism abroad. So next slide, please. The Philippines is also the deadliest country for environmental defenders in Asia and the 3rd deadliest in the world. Human rights and environmental defenders are constantly surveilled, arrested, tortured, and even killed under the current Duterte administration. From 2016 to 2020, there were 186 killings of environmental defenders, many of them indigenous. Even as recently as February 24th, there was another massacre of Lumad rights advocates, with 5 deaths in New Bataan, including Chad Bok and Jerain, who were volunteer teachers for the Lumad school. So does anyone have any questions up to now of anything we've discussed?
Could you explain the green transition? I didn't understand that term.
That's just kind of the green transition kind of just means this like movement we see that's pushing us to kind of buy solar panels and buy like electric cars and in an effort to kind of place the onus on individuals to kind of change our habits to like help the climate. But we were actually talking about how a lot of these raw materials used to make these technologies are actually being mined abroad. And as you know, as we mentioned earlier in the presentation, the mining of these raw materials, these raw metals, these precious metals, is causing ecological degradation in places across the world, but especially in the Philippines.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Of course. Okay, so next slide, please. So what can we do? It is our responsibility to rise up alongside the Filipino people and stand in global solidarity. You can help expose to the whole world that imperialists not only violated human rights, but exploited lands and natural resources and destroyed our natural wealth. And we have to stop this exploitation and destruction. This exploitation and destruction and violence bleeds into almost every part of life in the Philippines, including and especially with the upcoming elections, as Danny will talk about in the next section.
Thank you. So yes, I'm Danny Monahan. I am from C-Chirp also, and I will be talking about elections in the Philippines, which is particularly relevant because this year is an election year in the Philippines this summer. So moving on, could I get, let me see. Could I get David, would you be able to read this slide for me real quick?
Well, you might want me to read it. Let's see. I frequently change houses because I carry the weight of their threat that they will kill me and my family. I fear more for my family, not really for myself. That's why I haven't been home. This is their way to silence me and to stop me from joining rallies. Lay Kunsad, progressive organizer with the Alliance of Concerned Teachers, ACT.
Thank you. Sorry for putting you on the spot like that. I just like to, I don't know, I like to have people read the quotes so that I'm not talking the whole time.
No problem.
All right. So yeah. Thank you. Again, the quote is from Lai Khonsad, who works with this progressive party list for teachers, which is very very relevant to the election cycle. Like she's being targeted as a progressive organizer with like the progressive parties in this Filipino election. So yeah, as indicated by that quote, political organizers in the Philippines face a significant threat of violence and death from the Filipino government. The Philippines is, of course, not a safe place for progressive or opposition activists to begin with, but violence in the Philippines ramps up dramatically during the election season. As you can see in the graph here from Pacific Affairs, attacks on organizers during election season can more than double during the election season compared to other times of year and other years in the Philippines. As you can see here, the number of attacks jumps from almost 20 a month average to over 40 a month average. Yeah. Historically, elections in the Philippines have been marked by vote buying, ballot snatching, fraud, and state-sanctioned violence. A particularly standout example of this was during the years in which Ferdinand Marcos was in power from 1965 to 1986. During Marcos' reign, martial law was declared, and Muslims, suspected communists, and political opponents were arrested en masse. Marcos' dictatorship was eventually thrown out by the People Power Revolution, following massive unrest resulting from economic collapse and the assassination of the main political opposition leader at the time. The United States backed Marcos militarily and politically because he promised to fight communism and allowed the United States to build military bases. And the Reagan administration protected him when he fled the country to Hawaii in 1986. The legacy of violence continues into this day, with one of the starkest examples being the Maguindanao massacre of 2009, where 58 people were killed over a political rivalry, many of whom were family members of the candidate Ismael Mangudadatu, in addition to media workers and even a few unaffiliated civilians. All right. Lorena, could you read this slide or the quote at the top here?
Sure. Duterte is desperate to remove Makabayan from Congress. He's very desperate to stay in power. Ikaw Bicolana, Gabriela, Women's Rights Group.
Thank you. So yes, relating to that quote, the Duterte administration has been currently attempting to ban the progressive bloc from elections by redwashing them or branding them as communist terrorists. The tactic has long been supported by the United States government and is used to deprive activists affiliated with these parties of their basic human rights. You can draw somewhat of a parallel between this and the recent attempt in the United States to brand Black Lives Matter protesters and advocates of police reform as anarchists, looters, and terrorists, in order to manufacture consent and draft laws for violent suppression of these and other protesters. In the Philippines, nearly 4,000 progressive activists have been arrested during Rodrigo Duterte's term, and at least 414 have been killed. It must again be driven home that the United States condones and materially supports this with military aid. The current frontrunner candidates in the Philippines right now are Bongbong Marcos and Sara Duterte, the son and daughter of Ferdinand Marcos and current President Rodrigo Duterte, respectively. The current Duterte has run out his current term limit, which is why his daughter is running in his place now, essentially. As you can probably surmise from this ticket, a large majority, between 70 and 90% of elected officials in the Philippines are members of family dynasties. Marcos has refused to address comments on his father's dictatorship and has vowed to continue Duterte's war on drugs, which is the pretense for much of the extrajudicial murders that have been occurring in the Philippines. It's really worth driving home that Marcos' son being a viable political candidate, much less president of the Philippines, is a massive blow to all the people who worked to oust the elder Marcos from power so many years ago. It's a massive insult to the Filipino people, and it's only possible because of the heavy influence that the United States has on Filipino politics, as well as the particular function of the Filipino political system, which includes the violence interwoven into everyday politics and the fact that a candidate needs only a plurality and not a majority to win, with even the most popular presidents typically only receiving around 40% of the vote. In summary, history has shown us that the elections are the playgrounds of those already with power and wealth, vulnerable to manipulation through various means and plagued by a culture of impunity, fake news, and political dynasties. However, history has also shown us that the elections are a time where many people actually come together and get engaged on social issues. People organized and are conscious and are the main agents of change. It is through the active participation of people that the cause of human rights, democracy, and sovereignty will be advanced. Election season in the Philippines is a time of year when many Filipinos are trying to get involved with politics, and the violence surrounding the election can be a traumatizing and radicalizing event for many. Peace in the Philippines means putting our best foot forward to end American interference and military presence in the country, as well as doing all we can to support democracy and self-determination for the people. Organizing is a right and duty. I would like to take a brief minute here to reflect on what we've discussed. Can you imagine doing the work of CAPA in the context of the Philippines? How would it feel? What would it change in your life? And if anybody wants to speak on this right now, I'd be happy to take a few minutes. All right. If not, then I will simply let the question stew in your brain, and I will pass it on to Love to talk about people's resistance.
Thank you, Danny. I think we can confidently say we're in a crisis in the Philippines, right? Yet in spite of, and really because of just that, people's resistance persists. In the US, organizing is very scattered comparatively. We've got folks working on police accountability. We've got folks working through labor unions, blockading pipelines, calling to end war, right? But it's hard to imagine all of these distinct groups falling under one banner or one united movement. Slide, please. In the Philippines, all these different issues fall under the cause of national democracy. National meaning fighting for the true sovereignty of the Philippines, free from foreign control or influence. Democracy meaning it serves the majority of Filipinos, which is comprised mostly of workers and peasant farmers, many of whom are indigenous. And the ancestral lands of the indigenous, the fertile, mineral-rich lands of the countryside, are the front lines of climate catastrophe, right? Environmental justice then is necessarily a part of the national democratic struggle. These photos show associations and organizations of fisherfolk, of youth and students, of farmers and workers, organizations of women, organizations of church folks, all adding their sector's voice to the calls for environmental justice, to the calls to defend its defenders. So all the national democratic organizations of all the different sectors in Philippine society will rally, will mobilize, not just one org or one set of orgs, but the entire national democratic movement in all its platforms, mobilizing to the streets, to the polls, to the countrysides. So the overall struggle for environmental justice in the Philippines is truly very wide and deep and vibrant. Slide. Of course, following the guidance of those most directly and severely impacted by climate crisis under imperialism or climate catastrophe, right? The indigenous, the lumad, the peasant farmers and land workers. Indigenous peoples in the Philippines have always been at the forefront of environmental injustices in the country, since the large-scale timber logging of the 60s and 70s to the large-scale extractive mining that you heard about today. It's no surprise then that indigenous leaders have declared a pangayawa, or a tribal war in defense of their ancestral lands. And you can go ahead and click once. And we see this manifesting as educating, as organizing, and as mobilizing to defend environmental justice and to defend environmental defenders. They are protesting in the streets, pushing for legislation to win reparations, putting up candidates. Last election season, the first Lumad woman was sworn into Philippine Congress. They're organizing speaking tours and international solidarity missions to raise their calls and ask not just the Filipino people, but the entire international community to uphold their fight. Slide. And as a diasporic people, right, there's an overseas expression of the want for genuine social change in the Philippines. One such organization is the International Coalition for Human Rights in the Philippines, of which CHIRP and Anakbayan Chicago are a part of, and Kappa could be too. Overseas Filipinos are linking and raising the issues here to the issues of our homeland because there's a clear need for international solidarity in support of the Philippine struggle. Billions of US dollars are going towards human rights violations in the Philippines, and they decided to cut federal funds for COVID response while we're still in an active pandemic. Billions to a Philippine government known for election fraud and violence, and we still don't have affordable health care or economic relief. We still don't have clean, lead-free, oil-free water throughout this country. You know, Filipinos in the US are seeing these contradictions and speaking out, protesting at their regional consulates, building broad coalitions and international solidarity to have united opposition. And we're calling upon all peace-loving people to not only help raise awareness, but to really join us in lobbying, join us in the streets, add your voices to the Filipino people's call for justice. And while talking about resistance in the Philippines, I would be remiss not to mention the Civil War. You know, right before this portion, you heard the conditions of the country. You were asked to imagine the work you do in the context of the Philippines. We're seeing teachers be afraid to go home. We are seeing schools not just being closed down, but schools being aerial bombed with our tax dollars. You know, we're seeing journalists killed in the dozens historically, and community healthcare workers be killed in the streets today. And it's not just the direct violence, but the indirect violence. You know, when I was in the Philippines, I stayed with a family who lost their first child on the cold concrete of an evacuation camp. There are families who take stones from the river and boil them so they may pretend their boiling water is fish soup. Parents who have resorted to scouring their drought-stricken fields so they might catch a rat to feed their children. You know, violence takes many forms. And it is a reality that there are those in the Philippines who have seen no other way but to take up arms. Because for them, you know, with the reality of the situation, as you heard today, the options are you die hungry or you die fighting. So regardless of what our perspective is on the Civil War or taking up arms, the reality of this form of struggle is a testament to the grave situation in the country. It is a testament to the severity of the landlessness, of the joblessness, of the corruption and injustice that imperialist splendor maintains and exacerbates. Regardless of what our perspective is, it is clear that the Filipino people on the whole want genuine social change. And it is not our role as people outside the country to determine how that happens. But what is our role, right? What can we do as peace-loving people? What can we do in international solidarity? Go ahead and click, please. Thank you. So how can CAPA get involved? Well, you heard that Bongbong Marcos and Sara Duterte are currently running in the 2022 Philippine elections. Knowing the corruption in the Philippines and understanding all that's at stake, an opposition win could mean Duterte is tried in both domestic courts and the International Criminal Court. Knowing all of this, iChirp is helping to organize an international observers mission, and our organizations are raising funds to send at least 4 delegates to join them. iChirp being the International Coalition for Human Rights in the Philippines, the US chapter. So this is an ask from our compatriots back home to help ensure a clean and honest election process, especially with what's at stake. 2 generations haven't even passed since the Marcos dictatorship was ousted, and they're already back in the political sphere. They're already running for president. It's an absolute affront to what the Filipino people have been through. So if you want to help get folks to the Philippines in order to observe the elections, you can donate to CCHRP at CCHRP on Venmo with the note IOM or International Observers Mission to help get some of our folks out there to answer this call. And again, with all our tax dollars in the forms of US military aid, in the forms of State Department arms deals, right? With all our tax dollars being funneled into human rights violations in the Philippines, our organizations with iChirp and Malaya, the Malaya movement, have helped put forward the Philippine Human Rights Act, which intends to suspend US military aid on the basis of human rights violations in the Philippines, and really pushes for an independent investigation of state and military abuse. These kinds of legislations have been successful in the past when US funds were cut from the Arroyo administration in 2009 for their slew of abuses. So we're trying to do that again. So please have your organizations endorse the act, reach out to your legislators. You could probably tweet Brad Schneider right now if you wanted and ask him to support the Philippine Human Rights Act. And just stay updated on this campaign. And also ask your membership, right? Ask your folks to talk about what's going on in the Philippines with their communities. Share these calls to action with them. Ask them what they think, y'all can do. How do we link and raise your organization's issues to that of the Philippines? Because it's our understanding, right, that it's all connected and that our liberations are all connected. So let's keep our organizations working together. Let's plan solidarity actions, events together. Let's build genuine relations, right? Because we have to. We're fighting an empire. We're fighting a dictators, right? We're plural now with Marcos and Duterte. And if Marcos Duterte are elected in May, it's possible that another people power revolution in the Philippines may happen. And the international peace-loving community has to build our capacity to be able to respond to that accordingly. So let's just keep working together and let's stay plugged into what each other are doing. And also check out our link tree. You can go ahead and hit the next slide, and that'll wrap up this portion. I will pass it off to our moderator, or if anyone has any questions.
Thank you so much, Love, and to all of our presenters. This was, I think for me, a very profound educational moment, and I hope it was the same for everyone here. I am very glad to see there's so many actions already taking place, and you definitely have the gears running in my head as to what CAPA can do to support the movement. I'm very grateful to all of you being here. I agree with what I believe Bev said at the beginning, in that the Philippines is an intersection of many peace movements that doesn't get the attention it needs. But with that, we do want to leave we got about 9 minutes left, leave it open for Q&A. So if anyone has questions, you can either type them into the chat or raise your hand. I can also pose a quick question that's been on my mind. So it looks like you already have some really great action items, but I'm thinking, my head's in like BDS mode all the time. So I'm curious, what corporations are sort of most involved and have the most dire effect on the Philippines environment, especially with stealing land from the Lumad people. So I'm wondering if there are what the corporations are, and if there are existing movements to either boycott these corporations or sort of just call them out publicly, protest, etc.
I think if nobody else wants to speak, I would like to mention that one of the things that Will touched on was that a lot of the extractivist practices in the Philippines are raw materials, which are used to make a lot of different things. Like lumber is one of the main issues. Like a lot of logging industry actively destroys the ability of the Philippines to deal with like major typhoons, like the recent typhoon Odette. And also mining, like copper mining and things. And these are such broad industries with so many actors and so many consumers of these like basic raw materials that it's not really, as far as I'm aware, it's not really like meaningfully possible to try and boycott these things. Like you can barely trace like where the lumber, where the copper is going to. Like there might be Filipino copper in your walls right now that like we wouldn't ask you to rip out, and there might be Filipino lumber in your house right now that like you can't just disassemble. Like I don't know if anybody else wants to talk, if there are like specific ways that we've been attempting to do like sort of like economic action against like extractivist corporation, but that was my understanding. Will, and I guess Jan after that.
Yeah, I would say it's not an official boycott or anything like that. But when I was working in food service, I noticed that I was working at a pizza place, and I noticed that the pineapples we were getting were Dole pineapples from a plantation in the Philippines that had actually at one point been attacked by I believe it was either like guerrilla forces or indigenous people in retaliation for basically, I believe the way it worked was like the plantation was collaborating with local timber industries to clear out land and seize that land, first for the timber and then for the planting of pineapple. So I've kind of in my personal capacity, I've kind of stopped buying like Dole pineapple products. But I that's not an official boycott note or anything like that. Yeah, before we go to Jan's question, maybe I know Love has their hand up.
Yeah, it's an interesting question, to ask under imperialism. Right, exactly what Danny was saying about there are these like raw materials, and it's in so many things. Like how much gold is in your phone right now, in the laptops we're all on, in our cars that we drive every day. So I'm not sure if it's like as effective for us as people outside the country to target those corporations, but rather targeting the state governments that work with those corporations, or who's the governments of the companies who are working with those corporations. Yeah, is my thought on that.
Yeah, real quick, Lorena did have a very good bit in the chat as well. Many of the corporations have American backing, like the Malaysia International Mining Corporation is US backed, and And now they have the contract to develop the Liguasan marsh close to Mindanao, which was decimated by Duterte's martial law 2017 to 2019. Liguasan Marsh, which the US Embassy found $1.3 trillion worth of natural resources in. And also, just real quick, I think those of us who are presenting, if you want to reply to a question, like, don't raise your hand and wait. I think you should just open the mic because we'll get through it faster. Jen, yes, go. Sorry for keeping you waiting.
I was wondering if if American multi-billionaires have attacked not attacked, but gone into the Philippines for lithium.
As far as I'm aware, because, oh, sorry, you continue.
I was just going to say, I'd like to know which ones, if you know of them.
I do believe that this question came up when we were going through the lists of natural resources that have been taken from the Philippines, because we were also curious if the Philippines was a target for lithium extraction. As far as I'm aware, there aren't as meaningful lithium reserves there. And the main electronic component there is, again, copper extraction, which is also used in a lot of batteries, but has been getting less attention, I guess, because it's just so, it's something that's like been a natural resource that's been exploited rather than like a new natural resource that people are looking for new venues of exploitation.
Nickel is also a major mineral in the Philippines as well, which I know is a large component of like batteries and electric cars and such.
Oh, did you have something else, Jen? I thought I heard your voice again.
No, I just said thanks.
Oh, okay, cool. Yeah, no problem.
Yeah, and if anyone else has any questions, feel free to type them in the chat, or you can also raise your hand. We have 1 minute. Oh, we have 1 minute. So if anyone has like a really quick question, or if any speakers, panelists want to say any final words.
And I'd just like to thank all the panelists for into putting this discussion together and this presentation. I'll definitely be following up with your with the resources that you provide. You know, we've been hearing a lot from the U.S. government about how it's promoting democracy throughout the world, and yet when we're spending $300 billion on propping up this corrupt, awful government with its human rights violations, you know, I think there's a lot that we could still be doing. You know, going to the protest at the consulate. You know, we have new campaigns for putting together with going after our representatives on the Philippine Human Rights Act, getting them to support that.